I mean, she had to do a lot of research to find the appropriate pictures for the dialogue. But not only accumulating the pictures, but she wrote all of the script that our cast are going to be reading today. And that was not done overnight either. So I think we really have to recognize Janine Munsterman.
Hello, my name is Lyndon Warden from Madison, Minnesota, the county seat of Lac qui Parle County.
Eddie Robinson, Boyd. Kathy Fremont, Boyd.
Stan Olson, Madison.
Merle Munsterman, Madison. Dean Gallman, Bellingham, Minnesota.
Christy Werpy, Madison.
Bob Lofson, Madison.
Fred Eckhart, Boyd historian.
Jerry Osprey, Madison, Minnesota.
Alice Sherb, Lewisburg.
Peggy Crosby, Dawson.
Al Anderson, Madison.
Dave Peterson, Dawson.
Karen Tilbury, Marietta, and Nassau.
Sherilyn Bates, Dawson.
Doug Bates, Dawson.
Linda Anderson, Madison.
I, along with these people, will be telling the story of Lac qui Parle County. So let's get started. Obviously, the history of the area that became Lac qui Parle County did not begin just 150 years ago. It had inhabitants as far back as 9,000 to 12,000 BC. The Dakota people, mostly of the Wahpeton band, about 400 people, arrived around the 1600s. They settled in the Lac qui Parle area, moving their villages with the seasons, farming, hunting, and fishing. They grew corn, squash and beans, and made maple sugar and syrup. Fur traders like Joseph Renville and missionaries like Thomas Smith Williamson came later here. In the 1830s, missionaries started the Dakota Mission, which was the first church among the Dakota people in the upper Midwest. The missionary by the name of Stephen Riggs translated the Bible into the Dakota language and developed a grammar book and dictionary in the Dakota language. There is also a Dakota hymn called Lac qui Parle.
Many and great, O God, are thy things, maker of earth and sky. Thy hands have set the heavens with stars, thy fingers spread the mountains and plains. Lo, at thy word the waters were formed, deep seas obey thy voice. Grant unto us communion with thee, thou star abiding one. Come unto us and dwell with us. With thee are found the gifts of life. Bless us with life that has no end, eternal life with thee.
Over time, treaties were entered into with various tribes to obtain land for settlers. The tribes were promised goods, services, cash payments, and lands reserved for them. Much of the land encompassing Lac qui Parle County was sold to the United States in one such treaty. The lands were put up for sale, often to land speculators, which led to a large influx of settlers who clear-cut any timber available in order to build homes. They plowed up the land for crops and drove away game. The goods, services, and cash payments promised to the tribes often did not come. This failure was one of the reasons for the uprising of 1862.
One piece of Lac qui Parle history to note: the only white person in Lac qui Parle County killed during the conflict was Amos Huggins, a missionary and teacher to the Dakota. The conflict itself led to a narrowing of the reservation land, with some of it being in what is now Lac qui Parle County. Note the reservation line on the map. More and more settlers began coming to the area. Let's meet one of those early settlers, Frank Stay.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Francois Chaté. It's French. Have you ever had your name mispronounced? Well, that happened to me a lot. Somehow when I said Chaté, people heard Stay, so they automatically became, my name was Frank Stay. I was an adventurous young man when I came to the United States from Canada at the age of 17. I moved around a lot. In 1862, I farmed in southwestern Minnesota. During the 1862 uprising, Chief Red Dog, who I knew very well, came and warned me that the Indians were coming. I hid in the woods. Surviving the uprising, I eventually joined the Army under General Henry Sibley and was at Camp Release when the Dakota released their hostages, a total of 285 people. I didn't know it then, but one of those released later became my wife.
Frank Stay remained for several more years in the Army, serving in various areas in the western United States, but returned to Camp Release in 1868 to homestead. There he bought 167 acres at $1.25 per acre. He became one of the first permanent settlers in what would become Lac qui Parle County.
When another soldier who I served with in the Army, Joseph Sharon, who had settled in Missouri, became ill and he wanted to return to his homeland in Canada. His wife and 5 children stayed at my home in Camp Release on their way north. Joseph was too ill to continue on and died at my home. Later, I married his widow, Cecilia, and we had another 5 children.
Early settlers in Lac qui Parle County had the challenging task of breaking the sod. It was hard work. The roots of the grasses may run deep, and the old grass would pile up on the soil. Plowing through those grasses was a challenge. These settlers worked hard over the years and eventually carried out some good lives. The territory that was become Lac qui Parle County had been part of different Minnesota counties, including Dakota County, then Blue Earth County, then Brown County, and Redwood County. Finally, on March 6, 1871, the Minnesota legislature authorized the formation of Lac qui Parle County. Lac qui Parle is French and is translation of a native Dakota name, Talking Waters. The rapids in the river would make sounds as the waves bounced off the rocks as if someone was speaking.
Once the legislature made its decision to form Lac qui Parle County, it was up to the citizens of the county to form a government and determine a county seat. Meet our next guest, Browning Nichols, who helped establish a settlement in the years leading up to the county's formation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Browning Nichols, entrepreneur extraordinaire. I'm one of the founders of Lac qui Parle Village. My wife and I, with 5 other couples, own this fair town. Not to boast or anything, but I was one of the first commissioners elected to organize Lac qui Parle County, along with Colburn A. Anderson and Frederick Ehlers. It is because of the 3 of us that the county seat was situated in Lac qui Parle Village instead of nearby Williamsburg, originally known as Bison City.
A few years before in the area, a fellow by the name of William Mills had settled in this area around 1864. At the time he settled here, his nearest neighbor was 30 miles in one direction and 15 miles in another. He decided to start a town on his property, which, of course, he named for himself, Williamsburg.
He didn't remain the only settlers for very long. In 1869, a group of settlers, led by Peter F. Jacobson, called the Jacobson Group, moved to the Lac qui Parle area from Fayetteville, Iowa. They came with 42 people and settled around the area of the Minnesota River.
These settlers had discussions about establishing a church and a town. But where to locate it? Should it be north or south of the Minnesota River? A church was organized in 1870. It was the first church in the upper Minnesota River Valley. William Mills and others agreed to donate land for a town, a church, and a cemetery. It was planned that this town would be the county seat. By then, Williamsburg had one store. Some settlers located about 3 miles away from Williamsburg, they wanted their village in that area, and they would call it Lac qui Parle Village. They wanted it, not Williamsburg, to be the county seat.
Once Lac qui Parle County had been organized by the Minnesota State Legislature, 3 commissioners were elected to set up the county government. All of them, including Browning Nichols, were from Lac qui Parle Village, so of course, that became the official county seat. The one store that was in Williamsburg moved to Lac qui Parle Village, and Williamsburg ceased to exist.
There were 6 couples who owned Lac qui Parle Village. The proprietors of our little community at the time were not at all interested in community development. They were more concerned with protecting their investment. One of those couples was Henry Cross and his wife. Not much is known about Mr. Cross, other than he had a reputation for profiting from the citizens of Lac qui Parle, at least according to the Lac qui Parle Press, the county's first newspaper.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cross. My wife needs 10 pounds of flour and I need a pound of nails.
That'll be $5.
What? That's robbery. Flour is worth about 4 cents a pound and nails are a few cents a pound. How can you charge us $5?
Do you see any other stores? Go somewhere else if you don't like my prices. The nearest flour mill is Redwood Falls.
I think I shall faint, my dear. I can't bear it. Whatever shall we do?
I remember the high prices at the store. Folks, let me introduce you to Charles J. Colburn, a publisher and editor of the Lac qui Parle Press.
Thank you, Nichols. I had the honor of starting the first newspaper in Lac qui Parle County. I disagreed with a lot of Henry Cross's tactics. He started the first business in Lac qui Parle County, a general store, but he had no competition. I actually published a plea in my newspaper on June 11th, 1873, asking for competition. I wrote,
I was disappointed in the business part of the town, knowing the character of some of the proprietors. Business makes a town, and competition makes a lively business. There is, at present, one store in the village. In charging such enormous profits on all kinds of goods, they drive away fully 1/2 of the trade that would naturally center here. Will some liberal, far-minded merchant who wants to find a good opening come to the rescue of our county and the fair name of our little town?
Remember the horrible blizzard in January of 1873?
In addition to financial challenge, weather posed a hardship in winter and summer. Henry Cross and a fellow by the name of James D. Marshall and 2 other men got caught in that blizzard of 1873. There are 2 different versions of what happened to them. One story is that they survived 2 days and 2 nights buried in a snowbank along the river between Lac qui Parle and Benson. The temperature had dropped to minus 12 degrees. Marshall went for help and froze his feet. The other version is that they sought refuge in a haystack. They buried themselves in the hay, but Marshall's feet were sticking out, and that's how he froze his feet. When the blizzard subsided, they were only a few yards from a home. No one is quite sure which story is correct, But in both stories, Marshall's feet, sadly, had to be amputated.
Lac qui Parle Village seemed on the path to grow into a large community with a mercantile store, general store, farm implement business, meat market, a grain storage, hotel, hardware store, drugstore, school, newspaper, an attorney, a bank, and many other businesses.
But that all changed in 1884 with the arrival of the railroad.
The railroads built along routes they thought would maximize trade, and they bought the right-of-ways to include land for towns. Unfortunately, those routes did not include going through Lac qui Parle Village.
I heard the railroad is coming to this area. That will be a boom for our county.
But not necessarily for Lac qui Parle Village. I've heard it's going to go farther south.
I'm sorry, where are my manners? I would like to introduce you to Jacob F. Jacobson. You may recall the little discussion about the Jacobson group that settled Lac qui Parle County before it was a county. Well, one of these who came with Jacob F. Jacobson accompanied 3 of his brothers who settled in Lac qui Parle Village area.
Thank you for that kind introduction, my fellow citizens.
What are you doing?
Practicing my political voice. After all, I was elected county auditor in 1872, and I am the organizer of the Lac qui Parle Agricultural Society. I fully intend to get further involved in politics.
But in the meantime, you run a farm implement dealership in Lac qui Parle Village?
I do, and I own land in Cerro Gordo Township.
Back to the issue on hand. Is there anything we can do to persuade the railroad to come to this area?
I doubt it. The railroad people have a lot of money. They'll get investors to build towns along the railroad's tracks.
He was right. The railroads would encourage investment in the city chosen by sharing an undivided one-half interest with local businessmen. Dawson, for example, was owned by officials of the Bank of Minnesota in St. Paul. That bank owned land in Lac qui Parle, and it was their financial leverage that caused the railroad to build across their land. Dawson is named for William Dawson, president of the Bank of Minnesota. The city of Madison site was chosen for political purposes. It was planned to have it as the county seat, as it was platted in the exact center of the county. Madison formed a town site company made up of a number of men, including Jacob F. Jacobson, who moved his implement dealership there from Lac qui Parle Village.
Many citizens were not pleased with the actions of Jacobson and his cronies, but he was a mover and a shaker, and he was an organizer. He worked hard to get the county seat moved to Madison. When the railroad came through, many of the businesses picked up their stores, literally, and moved them to either Dawson or Madison. So to them, it made sense to move the county seat from Lac qui Parle Village.
Gentlemen, let me tell my story. In 1885, both Madison and Dawson petitioned the Lac qui Parle County Commissioners to have the county seat moved to their towns. There were hearings held, and in November 1886, there was an election in the county with a question on whether the county seat should move to Madison or elsewhere. Madison received 912 votes to 524 votes for other places, which included Dawson and Bellingham. Well, I'm not one to let grass grow under my feet. The next week, myself and a group of between 100 to 150 men from Madison and the surrounding area went to Lac qui Parle Village without informing most of the county commissioners or other county officials, and we moved the courthouse to Madison. We pulled that courthouse across the countryside. Okay, so we got stuck for a day or so, but the records made it to Madison, and I rode the roof of that courthouse into town.
A lawsuit was filed and a restraining order was issued restraining the county officials from conducting business anywhere but Lac qui Parle Village. The law under which the county seat was moved was declared unconstitutional by the Minnesota Supreme Court, and the records were ordered back to Lac qui Parle Village in September 1887.
However, in 1888, I was elected state representative from this area. On March 19, 1889, a law was passed authorizing the removal of the county seat with a notice of intent to circulate petition published in the local newspaper. I will admit I had something to do with getting that law passed.
Madison got their first petition notice published ahead of another petition planned by Bellingham. A special election was held in May 1889, and Madison eventually became the county seat.
Jacobson remained in the legislature for 14 years. An article about him appeared in the St. Paul Sunday Globe in 1895. It said,
Jacobson is a fighter from start to finish. A bluff has no effect on him at all, and no man has ever succeeded in bulldozing him. For forcefulness and influence, he is unquestionably the leader of the Republican wing in the House. Middle-aged and married, he is a credit to the Scandinavian race, as well as the Republican mogul of Lac qui Parle County.
Regardless of what people thought of him, Jacob was a force in this county. He was in his early 20s when he started his implement business. He was elected auditor of Lac qui Parle County and later state representative. He ran for governor. He was one of the organizers of the Farmers State Bank in Madison, which became First National Bank of Madison, and for a time served as its vice president. From 1904 through 1905, he was chairman of the Minnesota Board of Control.
I think I am as proud of founding the Lac qui Parle Agricultural Society as I am of any of my political achievements. We held the first fair in October 1873 at Lac qui Parle Village so the farmers could exhibit their agricultural products and have a holiday. That first fair was one day. In 1874, it was a two-day fair. The fairs were held in Lac qui Parle Village until it moved to Madison in 1886. By then, many of us in the Agricultural Society had moved to Madison. The society purchased land for the fairgrounds. I was on the fair board for 64 years.
So, let's have a fair. We'll have rides, games, and sideshows. We'll have food from church stands, selling dinners to booths selling cotton candy. Dealers show off the latest in farm equipment. Farmers bring in crops and proudly display their growing talents. Let's have races. Ladies, bring in that fancy work in quilts, your jellies and jams, your breads and baked goods. Families, bring in your garden produce. Children, show us your skills in art, writing, building, or science. Lac qui Parle has been doing this for nearly 150 years, and we'll be here for 150 years and beyond. Our fair is the oldest successive fair in Minnesota. It's fair time.
Our county fair is a great county fair. Don't miss it, don't even be late. There's dollars to donuts at our county fair. It's the best county fair in our state.
As was mentioned earlier, Charles Goggin started the first newspaper, the Lac qui Parle Press, in the Lac qui Parle Village. But he was by no means the only person to publish a paper in the county. There were a large number of others throughout the years.
While the Lac qui Parle Press was first published in Lac qui Parle Village, it moved to Madison with the coming of the railroad and changed its name to the Independent Press and later the Madison Press.
The Dawson Sentinel was started in 1884. It was first called the Dawson Eagle for the first couple of years, but changed to the Dawson Sentinel when Charles Coughlin bought the paper. He had also started the Lac qui Parle Press, but quit publishing for a while when he was elected Register of Deeds, then County Commissioner, and finally Justice of the Peace. When he left office, he went back into the newspaper publishing business. Coughlin was quite a character. He enjoyed doing battle with the Madison newspapers, making snide comments in nearly every newspaper. Of course, the Madison editors responded with some quips of their own.
The Western Guard started in 1891 and has been publishing continuously ever since.
The Madison Press quit publishing in the 1970s. Other towns in Lac qui Parle County also had their own newspapers for many years. There was the Boyd Bulletin and later the Boyd Advisor, the Marietta Messenger, and the Marietta News, the Nassau Review, and the Bellingham Times. It's quite impressive that 150 years later, the Dawson Sentinel and the Western Guard are still going strong.
As the years went by, the original courthouse that had been moved from Lac qui Parle Village outgrew its usefulness. It was just too small. In fact, a grand jury was convened to investigate and examine the courthouse. In May of 1898, the grand jury found that the building was unsafe for keeping public records and unsuitable for offices of county officials. The building was condemned.
Dawson was willing to build a courthouse at no cost to the taxpayer if the county seat was moved to Dawson, but alas, that did not happen.
The county seat stayed in Madison. The courthouse, was not without controversy. There was article after article in the various newspapers complaining about the cost. Finally, in 1898, the county commissioners decided to build the courthouse, but the cost was not to exceed $30,000. In today's dollars, that would probably be around $790,000.
In the end, the Lac qui Parle County Courthouse was built in 1899 with money well spent. The building remains a beautiful structure, has been kept up to date, and serves our county well. However, the location of the county seat and the courthouse was not the only controversy. In 1920, there arose a new issue surrounding the erection of a statue on the courthouse lawn.
I would like to thank the county commissioners for allowing me to speak at your meeting today. I was visiting your fair city and saw your beautiful courthouse. All it is missing is a beautiful fountain on its lawn. I am an artist, a sculptor to be exact. I envision a beautiful fountain depicting a woman or perhaps several women enjoying a beautiful day on this beautiful courthouse lawn. Do you agree? Thank you. I shall do you proud.
It is such a beautiful day for a stroll. Let's go look at the new statue on the courthouse lawn.
Let's do. I have not seen it yet.
They're nudes. They put statues of nude women in the fountain.
That did cause quite a stir. It did not sit well with the citizens of Madison. And in November of that year, someone vandalized the statues, tearing the arms from the ladies. The fountain was removed, and I don't believe there was ever another built. Jacobson, are you paying attention?
I was just reading one of our old newspapers. This is from the Dawson Sentinel's May 18th, 1900 edition. Listen to this. How many people from here realize, while in Minneapolis, as they gaze upon that mammoth building known as the Hennepin County Courthouse and Minneapolis City Hall, that it is built entirely of Lac qui Parle County granite? Very few, we say, but it is a fact nevertheless. The first story of the Milwaukee Depot in Minneapolis is built of this beautiful stone, and a good deal of it is used in the state capitol at St. Paul. Lac qui Parle County has had impact statewide.
One of the most important things for a county to have is a school. This was a priority for the settlers of Lac qui Parle County. Many schools were started throughout the years. In fact, there were 108 of them in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Some of them were held in homes, but many were one-room rural schoolhouses. The first public school was in Saragordo Township, when this area was still part of Redwood County. That school was located near Lac qui Parle Village. Saragordo was a township before this county was formed. After the county was organized, Lac qui Parle Township was severed off from Saragordo Township.
As a special assignment to celebrate the 150th anniversary, the students in our schools were given an essay contest challenge. They were to write a history of one of the towns in the county. The best essay on each town was chosen by the county commissioners. The winners are here today to present their essays. May I present Miss Evans, our essay contest teacher.
Good evening, class.
Good evening, Miss Evans.
Each of you is a winner in the essay contest. Tonight, you have the honor of presenting your papers to the radio audience. Let's start with Lac qui Parle Village.
Lac qui Parle Village was the first real town in the county. I guess anyone can declare a place to be a town, like William Mills did, when he said that the town was on his property and he named it Williamsburg. But it didn't last very long. Lac qui Parle Village had the first post office in 1871 and the first school in 1872.
During its early years, the village was growing with more and more people coming to live there, starting businesses and building homes. It had a general store, a furniture store, hardware store, drugstore, an art gallery, restaurant, even attorneys, school, bank, a newspaper, the Lac qui Parle Press, and an implement dealership, among other businesses. It was thriving.
Then the railroad came through and bypassed Lac qui Parle Village. Many of the businessmen took their buildings and moved either to Dawson or Madison. Lac qui Parle Village came up with an idea to sell bonds to bring a branch of the railroad to the village. Many of the most prominent citizens of the town signed off on the bonding resolution in 1888. But evidently it didn't get funded, as no railroad was ever built there.
The town became a very quiet little place, and today has no businesses, but it still is a wonderful little place to live at.
Next, let's have Lewisburg.
When the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway, which became Great Northern Railroad, decided to build a line across the northern part of Lac qui Parle County, towns developed along that railroad. Lewisburg was one of them. It was platted in 1887 on land owned by Ole Thompson. He named the town for his father, Lewis Thompson, and it was officially called Lewisburg. Lewisburg never had a newspaper and never had a high school, but it did have a school for grades 1 through 8. It was active with numerous businesses in the early days, but it never was a large town. But small towns are great communities. Here are some quotes from Lewisburg's Centennial book.
A small town is where you dial a wrong number and talk for 15 minutes anyway. A small town is where you take a walk and every car that passes offers you a ride. A small town is where you run your car in the ditch and the news gets back to town before you do. You know you're in a small town when people know you by your nickname. You know you're in a small town when people know where you live without having addresses in the phone book.
Lewisburg had many businesses in its early days. There were stores, a bank, restaurant, saloon, and a school. The school was built in 1911 and closed in 1970. There were plans to build a high school, but when Appleton and Bellingham started bus service around 1930, those plans collapsed. It built its own light plant in 1917 and had telephone service provided by Central Telephone Company around the turn of the century. A wooden church was built in 1891 and was destroyed by a tornado in 1905. A new wood church was built in 1916 and in 1926 was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. In 1927, this time a brick church was built and worship services are still held there. Lewisburg always had a great community spirit. When the restaurant closed, The farmers got together and put up the money to reopen it. It was run by Harold and Emily Hansen for many years before it finally closed for good.
Great report. Next, Bellingham.
Just like Lewisburg, Bellingham was built along the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad in 1887. And just like Lac qui Parle Village, people owned the town site. One couple were representatives of the railroad. The railroad always had their own people involved in building of towns so that they could get some of the profit from it. The other owners were Charles and Phoebe Bellingham, who owned the land where the railroad wanted to build the town. It is named for Charles Bellingham.
Bellingham had a newspaper called the Bellingham Gazette that was published in 1889, but it is the Bellingham Times that was more well known. It was published from 1891 to 1942.
Bellingham also had a very active school. Its first school was built in 1881 with a 2-year high school added in 1898 and a 4-year high school in 1912. Bus service was offered by 1936. Students had to pay to ride the bus, $3 a month for one student, $5 a month for 2 students. But as the years passed, the number of children living in the Bellingham area decreased, and the high school closed in 2007, with the elementary school closing in 2010.
There was a very popular kitchen band in Bellingham called the Kitchenettes, which started in 1972. They played kazoos, kitchen utensils, and other unique instruments. They even played at the state capitol and twice at the state fair.
Before we go on with the rest of your reports, I would like to introduce a very special guest who has agreed to join us today, Father Peter Rosen. Did you know that the community of Rosen was named after him? Well, he will tell us a little history of that community.
Guten Tag, Jungs und Mädels. I came to the United States from a part of Germany called Prussia as a Catholic priest and missionary. I spent much of my time in South Dakota, in and near the Black Hills. However, in 1895, I was sent to the northwestern part of Lac qui Parle County because the number of German Catholics had settled there and had no church. So on the prairie lands of Yellow Bank Township, a church was built. There was a smaller church first and then a brick church in 1907 after I'd already left. It was the United States Post Office that gave the community the name of Rosen in 1897. The post office may have well been named Rosen on the suggestion of the area residents. The first postmaster was Philip Carles, who built the first home in the community. I wanted Rosen to become an actual town, so I encouraged older farmers ready to retire to build homes around the church, and they did.
There was a store in Rosen, first owned by Philip Carles and then by John Stoll. The store carried dry goods, groceries, and notions. In 1953, Leonard and Norman Schmig built a new general store. There was quite a number of businesses in Rosen through the years, including a Firestone tire shop and a TV shop. There was also a Catholic school built in 1927 that closed in 1979.
Rosen had a cornet band, which I organized when I was the parish priest. The band played at the laying of the cornerstone when the courthouse was built in Madison. Its members erected the village hall in Rosen. The band was very civic-minded and worked hard to make Rosen a community. However, the band dissolved in 1914. And baseball, oh, does Rosen love its baseball. A baseball team was formed early in Rosen's history, and baseball is still being played today. Thank you for allowing me to tell you about Rosen. If you wish to read more about me and my writings, I'm in the archives at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Now, Auf Wiedersehen.
That was so interesting. Thank you, Father Rosen. Let's hear from Nassau.
Nassau, like Lewisburg and Bellingham, started along the railroad. A fellow by the name of Michael Mason settled what would become Nassau in 1887, at the time the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Manitoba Railroad was being built. He had a grain business, a general store, a hotel, and he was also a farmer. He was quite the businessman. Another gentleman, W.G. Mix, arrived in 1893. He helped organize the village and became the town's first mayor. He was also a hardware merchant.
A couple of newspapers were started, the Nassau Advertiser in 1904 and the Nassau Review newspaper in 1916, but no newspaper permanently took hold in the town. There were once 3 churches, a Congregational Church, St. James Catholic Church, and the St. Paul Lutheran Church. The St. James Catholic Church was closed and its building became the community center.
A school started in Nassau in 1888 and at one point had 2 years of high school. In 1958, 7th and 8th graders began attending school in Marietta with grades 1 through 6 taught in Nassau. The school closed in 1968 when Nassau and Marietta consolidated. Then, when Marietta consolidated with Madison, all students began attending school in Madison. In 1989, a monument was built where the front doors of the school once were.
At one time, there was a community brass band, a baseball team, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, the Woodman's Lodge, Catholic Order of Foresters, Royal Neighbors, and Rebecca Lodge. The town seemed very community-minded. There was even the Nassau Dramatic Club. Though there are not a lot of businesses left in Nassau, it is a very important hub for farmers to sell their grain at the elevator and get their machinery from Walden Implement.
Thank you. And now, Boyd.
Boyd was found earlier than the towns you have just heard about it. That's because Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad came through the area in 1884. The town was named after Samuel F. Boyd, ticket agent for the railroad.
It eventually had its own electric plant and its own telephone company, the Boyd Telephone Company. By 1916, Boyd had a restaurant, 2 banks, 5 grain elevators, a flour mill, at least 2 general stores, any type of store you could want, from hardware to clothing to photography to builders. It had a hotel, a doctor, a veterinarian, a school, a newspaper, and churches. It had a population of about 600. There was even a golf course started in 1925, but it ended during the Depression.
Its newspaper was the Boyd Bulletin that started in 1897. That newspaper was published until 1954. In 1954, the Boyd Advisor was started. When the owner retired, the paper ceased.
Boyd was on the all-important railroad line. Some people tried to start the Ku Klux Klan in Boyd in 1920s. 2 crosses were burned to show their power. One on a lady's lawn while she was entertaining. Not sure what the problem was with her, but the people of Boyd did not support that organization, for it did not last long. Boyd School merged with Dawson Public School in 1969 for grades 9 through 12. 1970-71 for 7th and 8th, and in 1979 for the elementary school.
Thank you. Now, Marietta.
Marietta was organized in 1884 by Charles F. Hatch, a town site agent for the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, and Charles and Charlotte Summermeyer, the owners of the land where the railroad wanted to build a town. According to one source, pioneers of Marietta, Ohio settled there. It had its own newspaper. The Marietta News began in 1897 and was published until 1952. The Marietta Messenger began in August 1900. The first school began in 1897. There was an elementary and high school until 1990, when the last class of 9 students graduated. Lightning hit the bell tower in the old part of the school after school had been dismissed in 1990 and the school was destroyed. The decision had been made early in the school year that the 89-90 year would be the final year of the Marietta School.
Marietta was a bustling town into the mid-1900s. There was a business called the Lilly Thread Company that shipped thread all over the United States. Ralph Baker had that grocery store, more like a general store, in town and started Lilly Mills in the store in approximately 1939. The only other distribution centers for Lilly Thread Company were in Chicago and San Francisco. There was a post office, a drugstore, ice cream shop. There were 2 hotels that each had a cafe, 3 grocery stores, a locker plant, 2 lumber yards, a creamery that made butter, a barber shop, pool hall, even a popcorn stand if the weather was nice, 2 blacksmith shops, an implement shop, a furniture store with a funeral parlor, a school, and 3 churches. For a time, it had a mini golf course. There was a fire department, and it had its own light plant with some awfully daredevil line workers.
There was also a jewelry store and a bank. But then in 1970s, things started to change. Farm equipment was getting larger and more efficient. Larger equipment meant the ability to farm more land. And with the farm crisis in the 1980s, many farmers had to sell their land, which was bought up by farmers who then had even larger farms. Where there had been farms with 160 acres, there were getting to be farms with hundreds and even thousands of acres. That meant fewer farmers, which meant less business for the town merchants. Stores began to close. That is what occurred in Marietta. The once bustling community became a quieter one. Salt Lake, a great area for bird watching, is located only 4 miles southwest of Marietta.
There was one town that started near Marietta called Haydenville. 2 gentlemen, Gerhard Harrigus and Herbert Hayden, wanted to serve farmers between Madison and Marietta. They chose the name by a flip of a jackknife between Harrigasville and Haydenville. Guess who won? The town had businesses that sold implements and automobiles, a grain elevator, lumber yard, restaurant, and a school. A bank was built, but it never opened and was moved to Nassau. The town, while still on the map, does not exist and consists of only 1 residence. So, let's move on to Dawson.
Dawson started in 1884. The towns in Lac qui Parle County were mostly built by the railroads. The railroad people would get investors to work with a local landowner to plat out the town. One of the founders of Dawson was William Dawson, who was president of the Bank of Minnesota in Minneapolis. He and 2 other men bought the land for Dawson and called themselves the Dawson Town Site Company. They then sold lots for homes and businesses. They charged quite a good price for each, which surely left them very wealthy. In 1891, they sold the remaining unsold lots to the Dawson Town Site Syndicate, a group of local businessmen.
By December 1884, just a few months after the railroad first built its line, Dawson had 31 businesses, 60 buildings, and a population of 300. Every able-bodied man was required to put in 1 day a year to clean up the streets or pay a fee of $1.50. Some of the businesses were moved to Dawson on skids from Lac qui Parle Village after it did not get the railroad.
A school was started in 1884, the same year the town was founded. Education was very important to the settlers who were established in Dawson. In fact, the site chosen for the school is the same site as the current Dawson Boyd Public School. After the merger of Boyd and Dawson, a new school was built in 1978.
Plays and musicals were always important to Dawson. There was an opera house that seated 800 people. The first movie ever shown was in 1912. It was a silent movie called The Sinking of the Titanic. Just think, There was no talking in the movies. All you saw was the picture. The theater had a piano player who would play certain music for the mood. Let's say that the villain was going to capture the good guy. The music would sound like this. And if it was a love scene, it might sound like this.
That opera house had the name The Swinging Door because the fire marshal required the doors to swing outward for safety. A movie theater was eventually built, and it was called the Grand Theater. That name sounds very familiar.
Another part of Dawson is the Carnegie Library. The town's father started a fund in 1886 to build a library. First, there was a traveling library in the drugstore, and then a small library in the school's superintendent's office. In 1915, the mayor contacted Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was helping towns build libraries all across the country. He had some rules, and if towns promised to meet his requirements, the Carnegie Foundation would give the town money to build a library. Dawson promised to furnish a lot on which to build the library and pledged $900 a year to support it. The Carnegie Foundation gave Dawson $9,000 to build a library, and it was built in 1916. The building is still being used today, though not as a library.
In 1902, the first hospital was built in Dawson. In 1914, a hospital was built called Dawson Surgical Hospital. It was 3 stories and had a nurses' training school from 1915 to 1932 with a dormitory for the students. The nurses would train for 2 years at the Dawson Hospital and then 1 year at either Minneapolis General Hospital or University Hospital. Dawson had 2 very important doctors during that time, Dr. C.M. Johnson and Dr. H.M. Johnson. Dr. H.M. Johnson was one of the incorporators of the hospital. His son, Dr. V.M. Johnson, nicknamed Bill, joined the staff in 1940.
In 1974, a new hospital was built, dedicated in 1975 as Johnson Memorial Hospital to honor the long service of the Johnsons. Dawson has had some very long-term businesses. Erickson Chevrolet was started in 1935 by Ernie Erickson. He acquired the Chevrolet dealership in 1941. Lac qui Parle Co-op was organized in 1924 as Dawson Cooperative Oil Company. They purchased Midwest Fertilizer from Rudy Presto. They continue to have a strong presence in Lac qui Parle County with a subsidiary branch in Madison. Lee Motors was started in Dawson in 1930 by Arthur Lee. He had been in business with his brothers in Madison called Lee Brothers, which was a Ford dealership that started in the 1920s, but Arthur decided to buy his own dealership. Both Lee Brothers and Lee Motors took horses and other livestock as trade-ins for vehicles. Art Lee later added the John Deere line to his Ford business in Dawson. Hanson and Dahl have been in Dawson since 1915, first with a furniture store as well as a mortuary. They closed the furniture store in 1982.
Dawson is nicknamed Gnome Town. Have you noticed all the gnomes along Highway 212 in Dawson? In 1988, Dawson decided to start honoring a local citizen for commendable work in the community by having a local artist carve their likeness as a gnome, which would be placed in the park. The announcement of the current year's honoree is done at Riverfest, Dawson's celebration held the last weekend in June.
Let me introduce you to one of the gnomes who will tell you their story as first told by Alta Roche.
According to the legend of Gnome Town, the little people knew that no one believed in them anymore. Human adults were far too busy, and human children only wanted to watch television. They had to decide if they should band together and move across the sea, or if they should simply be no more. And so old Torvig, a member of the Council of Little People, made this pronouncement to his fellow woodland creatures. Whether leprechaun or kobold, we will now be called gnomes. We will cross the sea to a place called Minnesota, and there we will go to a peaceful city called Dawson. The people there from the country and the town work together to make good things happen. For us, this will be a good place. When we get there, we will show them we are neat, helpful, and will bring a smile to their faces. We will show we have heart. We will wear it on our sleeves for all to see. And Dawson will be Gnome Town, Minnesota.
What a wonderful story.
I win the whole essay contest for being the most creative, right?
We'll see. Let's hear about Madison.
Madison, as with the other towns in Lac qui Parle County, was established by a group of investors who believed that putting a town in the geographic center of Lac qui Parle County would mean that it would be eventually the county seat. The land they purchased was a little low and swampy, but it was the center of the county, and so that is where they established the town. Madison is named after Madison, Wisconsin. It's on the 45th parallel.
What does it mean to be on the 45th parallel?
Well, parallel means that two lines never intersect, right? So what is it parallel to? One of the other towns?
I think we're getting a little far-fetched here. Please just read your essay.
Okay. It means that Madison is halfway between the North Pole and the equator. You can have your picture taken by the 45th parallel sign at the Lac qui Parle Museum.
Now I get it. The North Pole is very, very cold, and the equator is very, very hot. So the weather in Madison must be perfect.
I don't know. I'm just a kid, not a scientist. Anyway, when Madison was first established in 1884, many of the citizens of Lac qui Parle Village put their houses on rollers or skids and moved them to Madison. Businesses, too, were moved that way. Those people wanted to be in a town with a railroad. Madison kept growing and became quite a prosperous town. It established a fire department and built a hospital that was the only hospital between Minneapolis and Watertown, South Dakota for a period of time. It established a college called the Luther Normal School. In fact, in 1890, when the United Lutheran Church decided they would build and support a school, there were many towns that offered to have it built there. Madison guaranteed $16,000, which would have been a very large sum at the time, and free transportation of building materials. Madison was chosen as the location for the school. It was built in 1892 on the location where Hilltop Residence is now located. However, the normal school closed in 1932.
There were bank robberies in the 1930s. In 1933, Klein Bank, now called Old National Bank, was robbed twice. Once in February, where the robbers stole over $8,000, and once in April, when they got $2,000. The last robbery, though, was the scariest one. Someone managed to set off the alarm, which alerted people to what was happening. The postmaster shot at the robbers, and so did others in town. The editor of the Western Guard was shot at, but the bullets missed him. Others weren't so lucky. Your parents and grandparents may know some of the people who were shot. A fellow by the name of Z.L. Hayden was shot in the chest and leg. Hans Strand was hit in his hand, and Jens Evenson in the leg. None of the bank employees inside the bank were hurt, but at least one of them, Vern Molstead, had been in the bank for both robberies.
Madison has had some very famous citizens. You've already heard from Jacobson. He was so important to Madison, getting the county seat and our state legislator, that Madison named a park for him. The park is near the fairgrounds.
Another important person was Theodore S. Slen, a judge from Madison. He was a teacher in our rural schools, attended St. Olaf College, and earned his law degree from the University of Minnesota. During World War I, he was stationed in Europe and was wounded in France. He received the Purple Heart, a Silver Star, and Francis Croix de Guerre Award. He returned to Madison in 1919 and began his practice of law and his career as a judge. He also served 2 terms in the Minnesota legislature and was the first chairman of the DFL party. He was a charter member of the Madison Kiwanis Club. The swimming pool park is named after him.
And speaking of Kiwanis clubs, the Madison Club started in 1929. There are also 2 study clubs, Lions, and the Sons of Norway that started around 1905. That's about 115 years ago and is still active. These are all service clubs working for the betterment of Madison.
Madison has so much to be proud of. The City Hall has been in use for over 100 years. The library is a Carnegie Library built in about 1905 with the Carnegie Foundation providing some of the funds. That library is still in use as a library to this day. It, along with the City Hall and the courthouse, are all on the National Register of Historical Sites.
Something else that is very special in Madison is the Prairie Arts Center. When the First Lutheran Church and the Madison Lutheran Church merged, a new church was built called the Faith Lutheran Church. That left the First Lutheran Church empty. Some visionaries in Madison saw that building and just knew it could become something special. It was purchased in 1973 and was renovated into the theater you are sitting in today. The Lac qui Parle players also perform here yearly, and there's also a festival every year called Stinker Days.
There must have been a lot of skunks in that town.
Yeah, and they sprayed everyone, and they all stunk.
It was called that because in 1957, Madison decided to pave its streets. In August of that year, the project was finished and was celebrated as Blacktop Days, but eventually was changed to Stinker Days because people remembered the smell of the tar. And now we celebrate Stinker Days every year. When Madison needs something, the citizens pull together to get it done. There are 2 perfect examples. $110,000 was needed to bring the theater into the 21st century with digital projectors and new screens. In a matter of a few months, that was done. Another fundraiser allowed the theater to put in all new seating.
What are you doing?
I'm thirsty with all this talking. Besides, it's part of my speech. Did you know that in 1917, Henry Roth started a bottling plant in his basement? He used a hand capper and bottled 20 bottles of pop a day, which he delivered in a hand-pulled cart. He named his company Madison Bottling Works. His original building was at 628th Street. That building later became Madison Meats, owned by David Roth. Madison Bottling moved its plant to a new location on Highway 40 at the east edge of Madison. It's been in business for over 100 years. Madison Bottling remains a family-owned business.
When the 1930s swimming pool needed either serious repair or build an entirely new pool, the citizens again went to work and raised much of the money needed to complete that project, and there is now a beautiful new pool. And all of Madison can be proud of the county courthouse. It has been maintained and modified as needed and kept as beautiful as the day it was built nearly 125 years ago.
Thank you. That was an interesting report about Madison.
Excuse me, you left out a very important part of Madison.
And what is that?
That we are the lutefisk capital of the United States. I'm sure you've seen lutefisk near the fairgrounds. He represents our famous status.
Are you Jerry Ostras, the lutefisk eating champion?
Why? Yes, I am.
You've won so many lutefisk eating contests that I think people have lost count. I heard you were even on David Letterman, but I heard you lost to a fellow from Norway.
That wasn't a loss. He cheated.
How's that?
Well, this Norwegian television host was filming in Minnesota and heard about my lutefisk eating capabilities and challenged me to a contest. We met in Hutchinson, Minnesota, and they filmed the event. I couldn't keep up with him, but when I found out he had a vacuum hidden under his shirt and was stuffing the lutefisk into the vacuum, so I really won that one too, because I ate my lutefisk.
Madison was settled by mostly Norwegians and over the years celebrated their Norwegian heritage with special events and the lutefisk statue, where people often have their pictures taken. And there is even a song about Madison written by Luther Bjerke. Class, let's sing it.
Lutefisk and lefse and a norski meatball. Madison, Minnesota is a lot more than a mall. Lutefisk and lefse on the 17th of May. Madison, Minnesota, lutefisk capital USA.
Thank you, class, for the history lesson on the towns in Lac qui Parle County. On that note, class time is up. Class dismissed.
By 1916, there were two accredited high schools, Madison and Dawson. Bellingham, Marietta, and Boyd later built high schools as well. Nassau, Rosen, Lewisburg had elementary schools. The closing of the schools was a hard decision for these towns to make.
When Madison had a fire at the high school in 1987, it was decided to build a high school in the country with some of the area towns because all of the area schools were experiencing declining enrollment. Madison, Appleton, Milan, and Marietta Nassau formed Lac qui Parle Valley High School. Today there are two high schools in Lac qui Parle County. They are Dawson Boyd High School and Lac qui Parle Valley High School. The two schools do combine for various activities, and they get along very well. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the 10-minute intermission begins.
I think one of the most important things that occurred in Lac qui Parle County was the coming of the telephone that allowed for communication not only between just our local towns, but the rest of the state and the country.
I remember my grandparents talking about their old operated assisted phones and party lines.
Number, please. I wish to speak to Aunt Louise. Now I wish to speak very confidentially, if you please. Aunt Louise, this is your niece Patrice. Larry's been a problem child. He's in a squeeze. He stole a bottle of brandy. How me, oh my, he has embarrassed me. Just heard a click. Is there someone on this line? Get off this line, you rubberneck. This line is mine.
One ringy-dingy, two ringy-dingy.
Hello?
Is this the party to whom I am speaking?
Who are you calling?
Well, to whom am I speaking?
You don't know who you called?
I called the person to whom I am speaking. Your name, sir.
Oh, good grief. I'm Lucius Clark.
Good afternoon, Lucius Clark. How can I help you?
You called me?
Yes, I did. Are you important?
What do you mean, am I important?
Are you famous? Did you do anything important?
Do you consider starting a telephone company important?
Oh, yes, I do. If there wasn't a telephone company, I wouldn't have my job. What did you do that was so important?
I was one of the founders of the Bellingham Telephone Company. We started in 1904 with 36 customers. We grew to have subscribers from Bellingham to Lewisburg to near Ortonville and south beyond Nassau. My family owned the Bellingham Telephone Company through the 1930s. The Depression years were extremely difficult. Farmers weren't getting crops, that meant that they couldn't pay for phone service. And with fewer and fewer subscribers, the phone company fell into a state of disrepair. Finally, in 1946, we sold the company to Lee and Ray Carpenter.
Oh, I remember them. Lee Carpenter was the night operator while he was in high school. He would sleep with the headphones on so that he could take a call at any time of the night. He earned $11 a week. Can you imagine sleeping with headphones on all night for $11 a week?
The Carpenters and their mother, Laura, owned the Bellingham Telephone Company until they sold it to Farmers Mutual Telephone Company in 1955. Farmers Mutual was also founded in 1904. It, too, suffered during the Depression. They lost subscribers because the farmers couldn't afford the $1 a month service charge. The company was in disarray and service was poor. But farmers wanted telephone service. In 1932, Oscar Valla, Johnny Bordson, Willie Moen, and Selford Moen formed their own telephone service by stringing wires on their barbed wire fences. That system worked well, though Farmers Mutual was not too happy about it. Selford Moen and others wanted a new telephone company. One of them was a close friend of Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey guided them on the steps to form a new telephone company. Humphrey helped them get a loan through the REC, the first phone company in the United States to do so. They decided to get rid of the old Farmers Mutual Company, which turned out to be a challenge because when a meeting was called, there was never a quorum. But finally, they were able to accomplish it. The company was then reorganized and incorporated in 1951 as Farmers Mutual Telephone Company, Cerro Gordo, with the director signing personal notes for $7,000 to fund the company and keep it solvent in its early years. With a $100,000 loan Farmers Mutual received from REC, it was able to put in a dial phone party line system.
What? What about my job? They took away my job?
Operators were still used, but not for every call. After Farmers Mutual bought the Bellingham Telephone Company, it built a new office building in Bellingham in 1960 at a cost of $20,000. You could probably get a job there. Marietta was added to Farmers Mutual in 1958. The next year, Farmers Mutual did more upgrades, this time burying the lines, making it one of the first underground systems in Minnesota.
That seems like a lot of firsts.
It is. Farmers Mutual is a leader in the industry. It has always been an innovator, bringing broadband to Lac qui Parle County when most of the state was still just talking about it. I heard that in 2019 it received an award for bringing gigabit broadband speed to Lac qui Parle County. What on earth is gigabit? And what is broadband?
I have no idea. Mr. Clark, I am so glad you called me. This was an interesting conversation.
Excuse me, you called me?
I have to go now.
afternoon, Ethel. How are you today? Oh, you want to place a call? Who do you want to call? Really? Did you hear that her husband just bought one of those newfangled automobiles? You hadn't. He broke his arm the first time he tried to crank it. Those things are dangerous. They're never going to last. Waste of money. Fine, fine. I'll place your call.
It looks like Bellingham Telephone Company is adding more lines, this time between Bellingham and Marietta.
That'll be nice. Then I can call my niece in Marietta.
One ringy-dingy, two ringy-dingy, long ringy-dingy.
What are you doing? That's not our number. Ours is long and a short, not two shorts and a long.
I know. It's Ethel's. I'm going to see what she's up to. Hush now.
Oh, do you see? Look at that tree. Look there. It's an Arctic tui. That is just never found in Lac qui Parle. Look.
Excuse me. Who are you?
My name is May Peterson. I'm fascinated with birds. My husband and I own Peterson's drugstore in Madison. We met while we were pharmacists in Ortonville and bought the drugstore in Madison in 1905. Poor Charlie died in 1938. I have discovered 286 different birds, and I've banded over 15,000. Many of the birds that I have found were in Salt Lake near Marietta. It's because of me that we are recognized by the National Audubon Society. It was in 1924 that I met Dr. Thomas Roberts, the curator of the University of Minnesota's Museum of Natural History. He was working on a diorama of prairie habitat and was looking for nesting sites of western Minnesota prairie birds. That really piqued my interest in the birds, and I became somewhat of an expert on my own in that area. If I can boast a little bit more, one of my sons, Charles Jr., is considered the godfather of historic preservation. He was an architect who worked for the National Park Service. His contributions were essential to show how old buildings should be documented.
We have Birding Weekend every April, and it is because of May Peterson's work. Birders from all over the country and sometimes other countries come here to look for birds.
One of the main reasons we have so many different types of birds is Salt Lake.
Wait a minute. We have a salt lake? Like a sea?
Well, we were covered entirely with water thousands of years ago. It was called Lake Agassiz. In fact, you can still see evidence of the lake in gravel pits in the Lac qui Parle County, where fossilized shells and shark teeth are very abundant.
Shark's teeth? There were never any sharks here. Come on, you're pulling my leg.
No, I'm serious. There were sharks, although not as large as the present-day sharks. Some other unique things about Lac qui Parle County is they have cactus and the prairie lady slipper.
We are not a desert, so it is weird that cactus do grow here. But I've seen them at Plover Prairie, an area of preserved prairie north of Bellingham. I've seen a lady slipper too, but you have to look closely in the tall grass during the month of May. The cactus are all over, right along the gravel road on the west side of the Plover Prairie.
I'm enjoying our walk through history. We've met J.F. Jacobson, talked a bit about Theodore Slen, but Dawson has its own claim to fame in the political world. Theodore Christensen.
I see that name every time I drive to Appleton on Highway 119. Theodore Christensen, Memorial Highway. How did he get so famous?
Let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, Theodore Christensen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Theodore Christensen. I'm running for the United States Senate. I want you to know that I am a candidate of all the people, not of any group or faction. I have no affiliations or alliances with any other candidate, and I shall write my own platform. I will discuss principles, not personalities. It is not my personal ambition and interest that counts, but the public interest. I am a Republican and quite conservative. I believe in hard work. I was raised in Lac qui Parle County and attended a rural school near Lac qui Parle Village. I loved learning. I wanted to go to high school, so I worked summers to earn the money to go. I graduated from Dawson High School and went to the University of Minnesota. After graduating from college, I was principal at Robbinsdale Public School. I used the money from that job to attend the University of Minnesota Law School, from which I graduated in 1909. I also met my wife, Ruth Donaldson, who was an English teacher while I was a principal. After graduation from law school, we moved back to Dawson, and I opened a law practice. But I also had a passion for writing and news, so I bought the Dawson Sentinel in 1909 and was its editor until 1925. During that time, I presided over the Dawson City Council for a couple of years and served in the Minnesota State House of Representatives from 1915 to 1925. During my tenure in the Minnesota House of Representatives, I sponsored a bill to blend 10% alcohol with gasoline. It took a few years for something like that to pass, I believe about 90 years. One of the reasons I sold the newspaper is because I became the 21st governor of the state of Minnesota in 1925, a position I held until 1931. While I was governor, I created the Department of Administration and Finance and cut millions from our state budget. I believe that I am the person you should elect as your next senator.
So, did you win?
I did not, but I served in the United States House of Representatives from 1933 to 1937. My wife died in 1944, and I married Mrs. Mamie Bundy of Chicago in 1946. We often traveled back to Dawson.
Theodore Christensen was in Dawson in 1948, coming back from a dinner when his car overheated. His wife walked to a nearby farm to get assistance because by then Ted was having some serious heart issues. While she was gone, he felt a heart attack coming on and drove the car to the farm. He honked the horn to get their attention. He told his wife he was dying and that he felt no pain. He died a few minutes later. Mr. Christensen was in Congress during some of our county's most difficult times. There was a depression and a severe drought occurring at the same time.
Depression years were a hard time. It was so serious that our banks in our county had closed. The government declared a bank holiday in 1933 to try to simmer things down a bit. With all that, there was no way for businesses to cash checks and no way for citizens to get cash if they received payment in cash.
Bellingham tried to solve that dilemma by having the businesses agree to take produce checks for payment. Since there was no way to make change, the businesses agreed to give tokens as change and accept tokens as payment. Luckily, that didn't have to go on for too long before a couple of banks reopened.
That helped with one problem, but not with a major one, failing crops and no income. The government stepped in with the Work Progress Program designed to put men to work on government projects. Our towns benefited from the WPA. Our swimming pools were built, schools were remodeled, sidewalks were built, water systems improved, city parks were developed, and bridges built, including the Milan Bridge that was torn down a couple of years ago and has now been rebuilt.
What about the people like me who weren't used to physical labor? Did they have to do that kind of work if they wanted a job?
Workers were placed in librarians in schools. Some restored damaged books, bound books, promoted creativity through programs for the art. Artists, writers, actors, filmmakers, musicians, and dancers were employed. One project had almost 400 artists locating designs from around the country and then drew images of those objects.
What were those designs used for?
I have no idea, but they sure were busy. There were over 2,500 murals painted around the period. 1,700 pieces of sculpture were installed in buildings nationwide. 6,600 authors and journalists chronicalized the landscape of America. So somewhere there would have been a job for you.
Hey, Terry!
Maynard! How are you doing?
We're finally done with college.
Yep. You sure changed since high school. I think I look just the same as then.
Well, I don't think I've changed, but I guess it's time to find a job, so now what?
We can work at a radio station. We know how to do that.
Do we want to work at one, or do we want to own one?
Where would we buy a radio station?
Not buy one. We'll start one.
Where?
Well, let's look at the map. Here's Benson, where we're at. The radio station there goes about, this far. Then there's a station in Montevideo that covers to about here. One in Marshall that goes about here. There's a section right here that has no station. Madison, Minnesota. Let's start a station there.
Sounds like a good idea to me. We'll do well there, but where are we going to get money?
Dad, have I got a deal for you.
Dad, we need you.
I think we have a winner. With our dad's investment and our knowledge and hard work, we'll succeed.
Yeah, but now that we've decided where, how do we go about it? What are we going to need?
That's a good question. I guess we need a license from the FCC. And we need a frequency on the radio dial so people know where to find us.
We'll need transmitters and an antenna. How about a tower?
We'll need land for that tower. I think we have to get permission from the Federal Aviation Administration to put it up. We'll have to put up a building also to house the transmitter.
We need a studio.
You know, I found 3 acres we could buy north of Madison for the tower. And there's space we could rent on Main Street, right in downtown Madison.
We can get some used equipment. We'll need a mixing console, microphones, turntables, tape recorders, among other stuff. We'll need a music library of 33 and 45 RPM records. And we'll have to get contracts with SCAP, BMI, and SESAC, so we have the right music to play.
We're ready to go. We're on the air. KLQP radio started on January 31st, 1983, serving a 5-county area in western Minnesota and part of eastern South Dakota. Like the Western Guard and the Dawson Sentinel, we're still all here. Join us on the radio.
Turn on the radio, let's hear the garden show, hear all the latest news. The price of corn is down, Maynard is such a clown. Find out who just died, where is the concert, listen to the football game. So listen every day to KLQP, KLQP.
This has been a great journey through the history of Lac qui Parle County. Have you learned anything?
Oh, absolutely. But I didn't know. I don't know what's going on.
Where are you going? Where are you going?
To Madison.
This is the kind of a roundabout way to get there. Who are you?
Huh?
Who are you?
Robert Black.
You're a poet, famous worldwide.
Yes, well, I suppose I am.
I'm a poet. How come you're so famous and I'm not?
Perhaps because my poems have been published.
Well, my poem should be published. Maybe you can help me get it published.
I'd have to hear one first.
Well, I got a great one. I have a dog and a cat. The dog ate my hat. And the cat, being a cat, just sat. Isn't that a great poem?
I think you want to do a little more work on that. Do you know there are people out there?
Yes, I know. You're standing on a stage. That's the audience. We've been presenting the history of Lac qui Parle County for its 150th anniversary.
Well, what a wonderful endeavor. Did you discuss pheasant hunting?
No, I guess we haven't. It's not really part of Lac qui Parle history.
Of course it is. I wrote a poem about pheasant hunting. It's called Hunting Pheasants in the Cornfield. Let me read you one verse so you can understand better my poetry. What is so strange about a tree alone in an open field? It is a willow tree. I walk around and around it. My body is strangely torn and cannot leave it. At last, I sit down beneath it.
How long you been writing poetry?
There was a teacher in high school who interested me in poetry. All you teachers out there know that you make a difference. You never know who you may inspire to do something great.
Tell us about your life.
Well, I was born on a farm in Lac qui Parle County in 1926. I enlisted in the Navy in 1944 and was in the service for 2 years. I went to St. Olaf College after a year, and I transferred to Harvard. I graduated in 1950 and spent a few years in New York. Those years were a struggle. I was determined to write 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I would work 1 day a week as a file clerk, typist, or a painter. I'd go to an employment agency for painting jobs, but I usually got fired by noon. Finally, they assigned me to paint the inside of a warehouse in Brooklyn. I'd go there by myself every Thursday and paint a portion of the wall blue. If the owner complained and asked why my job wasn't done yet, I'd say, I don't know. Some of the guys have gotten sick. It's hard to get good help. I lived in New York for 3 years. Then, in 1954, I attended a writer's workshop at the University of Iowa. I received a Fulbright grant that allowed me to go to Norway to translate Norwegian poetry into English. There were these wonderful poets whose poetry had not been read in the United States because no one had ever translated it into English. I decided to start a magazine for this poetry and called it the 50s, then the 60s, the 70s. We also published essays on poets and frankly insulted those who deserve it. During this time, I was living back on my farm in Madison, raising my family. I was on that farm for 25 years.
What do you think your most famous work is?
Probably Iron John, a book about men. That book has been an international bestseller and translated into many different languages.
Where did you write most of your poetry?
Probably in the studio on the farm. I took an old country school and converted it into my studio. I filled it with books. I love books. In the 1980s, the studio with all my books and furniture were moved to the Lac qui Parle County Museum. I think there are around 5,000 books in that studio, and they were all mine.
All right, so back to my poem. Do I have a chance of getting it published?
Nope, not a chance.
Another important part of our history is our patriotism, our men and women serving in the armed forces and our National Guard. The 1st Battalion, 151st Field Artillery, Battery B of the Red Bull Infantry Division of the Minnesota National Guard is located at Madison. We have active members of the Dawson and Madison VFWs, Marietta, Bellingham, and Boyd American Legions. Let me introduce Major Lyndon Warden, U.S. Army retired, to explain the history of the National Guard and the veterans organizations in Lac qui Parle County.
Thank you. The National Guard Armory in Madison was built in 1914 and today continues to operate. Matter of fact, that was the very first unit I joined. The Dawson Army was built in 1923, but when the National Guard restructured in 1992, the building was no longer used. Unlike many armories that were demolished, Dawson's Armory was remodeled to house the library and Heritage Court apartments. Our country has and continues to have a substantial number of its young men and women willing to serve our country, from the Civil War to the present. Some have paid the ultimate price. These soldiers are remembered every year at the Memorial Day service held in Lac qui Parle County. Members of the American Legion or veterans of the foreign wars will serve as honor guard and play taps at military funerals. For example, Carlisle Larson started playing taps in 1906 and has played 236 funerals. Unfortunately, Carlisle have recently passed, and a recording of him playing the taps were played. That makes number 237. Others have been held as POWs, such as Gordon Westby, who was a prisoner of war during World War II. I would like him to tell you his story.
I am pleased to be able to talk to you today. I think it is important to remember the world wars so that perhaps they never happen again. I was in the Battle of Bulge in Belgium, a very hard battle. I was captured by the Nazis on December 18th, 1944. We were marched every day from daybreak until nightfall until April 12th, 1945. That was 115 days of marching. We were given food maybe once every other day or once every third day, and no water. We were not allowed to talk to each other. I was exhausted and sick and was able to march anymore, so the Nazis just left me. I was found by the Americans and taken to an England hospital. I weighed 90 pounds, but I came home in July of 1945. I was married in 1947 and worked at Dawson Mills.
There was an American Legion post started in Dawson in 1921 called the Oscar Lee Post number 177 after the first war casualty in the area. The VFW post number 5247 of Dawson was chartered in 1947 and named the Strand Sabo VFW after Harris Strand and Lester Sabo, the first two men from Dawson who lose their lives in World War II. The Madison VFW was organized in 1941 with 40 charter members, all veterans of World War I. One of its main sponsorships is Summer Madison Baseball and Youth Summer Baseball and Madison Christmas Decorating Contest, which it has sponsored since 1949. The American Legion was organized in Madison in 1919. Both the VFW and the American Legion also have auxiliary organizations. The Disabled American Veterans and its auxiliary have members from the 7-county area. All of these organizations serve veterans and their families and the larger community. Bellingham's American Legion was started in 1920. Marietta and Boyd also had an American Legion. Each of our branches of our military have played an important role in our history. Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, and now the Space Force. Is there anyone in the audience who has served in the military? Please stand so that we may recognize those who have sacrificed for the greater good of our country. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the men and women who have served this great nation.
We've covered a lot of history of Lac qui Parle County.
I'm sure we missed some. I never realized that we had such a rich history.
It is a rich history. We hope you've enjoyed the journey. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for coming. See you in another 150 years.